Michael, a Mercedes guy here, and we're going to go off subject here and do some drywall. Now I saw the local guy on TV explaining how to do it. What a mess he made. And then he shows these big huge sanders that you use to take care of all your mistakes. Well, the way I do drywall, and I was taught by a professional, you never need sandpaper. You just do it. Do the mudding properly. The only thing you'll use sandpaper for is to make sure your tools are nice and slick and clean so that mud slides off easy. Now, start with, when you're mudding screws that are by themselves, in other words, they aren't in the joint, you never use a wide tool. Use a narrow one. A wide tool, you end up having more mud you got to clean off. And I just did my shop, if you remember from other videos, and I completely ran out of mud, so I had to actually buy a little bit just to do this. So, when you're doing screws, just use a narrow one. Very easy. You can make two passes, one way, one another, and then you'll have to hit this a second and third time because mud does shrink. So once it's dried for a day, hit it again, and so on. Now, when you're mudding, any mud that you've put on that's dried, before you hit it again, use a wider scraper and just clean off any excess. That way, you don't have to be sanding. Now, when you scrape, you can either forward scrape. You tend to dig in sometimes with the corners, or you can back scrape. Now, we're going to start over here. Drywall on the long way has a tapered edge. It's thinner here for about that much. The ends don't have tapered edge. I don't know why they don't make them with tapered edge, but when you have a non-tapered edge, it's a little bit harder to make a smooth joint. Now, the first thing you do, you run your tool over and see if any screws are high. If they are, you have your Phillips screwdriver handy and in your pocket and run that in a little bit more. Then you put on your tape and you use a narrow tool to mud. And normally you have it in your tray here. Let me put some in a tray. You want to make sure that the tray is clean. Now, if you happen to be mudding and you run into a little piece of something in the mud, it'll make a line. So when you scrape that off, you don't put it back in here, you scrape it on the outside of the tray so that you aren't messing with that piece anymore. Anyway, once you mud it here, you take off your excess and you're ready for tomorrow. Now, here's one I did yesterday, so it's ready to go. So before I mud it, make sure I scrape it. And you want to have a rag handy so you can clean your tools once in a while. Now you may, for doing sheetrock in a garage, it's not that critical. In a house, you're going to start with your narrow, advance to a wider, and then a wider yet. So I'm just going to go ahead with the wider one here. And if you do this without letting that dry, you really aren't going to get anywhere. So you wait a day, and then you have this condition, and you mud that. Clean that excess off, and then hit it again. Bingo. You don't have anything left over, except as you can see right there, a little bit of a high spot. You don't worry about that. You deal with that the next day. Now this is one that I've already done the 2 coats. So, scrape it, and that is beautifully flat. Now these are tapered. These 3 here are tapered. This one is a butt joint. So when you have a butt joint, this one's also a butt joint. Yeah, oh yeah, this is a butt joint. Now when you do a butt joint, it's different than a tapered joint. A tapered joint, you can run your wide trowel this direction, and you come out with a beautiful edge. But if you try that on this kind of a joint, you're going to be exposing the tape. So what you have to do is actually run your tool crosswise. And it takes a bit of finesse to get it so you don't leave too much, but you've got to leave enough to cover the tape, and don't worry about these lines. You'll just keep messing with it. Now this is a good example right here. There's a little piece of something right there. I'm going to take that out. I'm going to hit that again, and like I say, don't worry about that, because once it sets up, you just scrape it. Now when you have your tapered joints like this, it's much easier, because then you have a kind of a guide actually, because there's a hump right there and right there. So use your narrower tool. And then the next day you'll have this situation, and you can use a wider tool. And you'll have little voids like this maybe. So that'll be the 3rd day, is catching those voids. Because mud shrinks. This will shrink down to where it's no longer flat. It'll be indented. So that's this situation here. Do a scrape first, get that clean. there's some crap in it, in a couple of places. Made those lines. So rather than mess with that again, get rid of it. Then, if you want, you can do a super inspection after a day, and you might find a teeny void here or there. But in any event, before you paint, you want to back scrape this way. You can forward scrape, it's a little trickier because the corners might dig in. But that way, you don't have to deal with sandpaper and dust. Makes it easy. Okay, a few other pointers. When you're doing corners, buy one of these. It is great. And when you're doing your corner, you don't want it like this. You want it like so, and apply some pressure. Notice how that flexes. Makes it much easier. You do basically two jobs at the same time. Another thing, when you're dealing with these butt joints that have no taper, and you're doing a kitchen or a bathroom that you aren't going to texture, you really want these butt joints well done. So when I use them, I put the mud on a float, a big float like the concrete float, and that way, when I spread it, I can get the spread out about this far, because the hump is a little more noticeable, but if you taper it out, this does the trick. It's not wide enough, this is not wide enough to really do a nice job compared to a big float, if you want real perfection. Another trick too, that some mudders use, if you can get them, is a sponge like this that has rounded edges. This is for doing mud. And what you do with this wet, you very carefully hit the mud. You can only do really one or two passes. You can't do any more than that or you'll start dissolving the mud. But what that does is take off the very tiny high spots. Alrighty, good luck.